Hello, Madison High School students, English 232. Welcome to week two. I'm very excited to see how everybody is progressing in your analysis technique when looking at ghost dance songs from the Native Americans. So I'm very interested to see what y'all had to say about that. And I hope that you are finding the course material as interesting as I do so far. Um, so just as a note, the pages that I'm using are out of the Norton American Literature volume for the three sets. So the 1865 to 1914 is the one that we're working with right now. Um, and it's the 10th edition. If you have the 9th edition, there might be some pagination things where you have a page off here and there. So like if something happens and you need to scan something for you, just send me a quick email. I'm happy to do it. And I'm happy to support you as best I can. I know that the editions sometimes can get all wonky. So anyway, so there are several things I want to go over today. So as you are watching the video, a couple of things that I want you to think about is one, that I am going to be going over some material in this lecture that might help answer some questions like regarding transcendentalism. So make sure that you watch through. You're welcome to speed anything up if it helps, but I do think that there is some good information that we'll talk about here. Okay, so for the readings this week, we're going to be heading into American Romanticism and Transcendentalism. It's one of my personal favorite time periods. Um, it comes right around the American Civil War, and then a little bit after. And so this is prior to Reconstruction. So this is where we're going to see a lot of like heady idealism. So the readings for this week, I know that you've read some Whitman before. So I put in here just some Walt Whitman on page 19 and 22 of the Norton and Out of the Cradle. And this is just these are some of his most famous pieces. A couple of them we may have seen last semester. So it's more of a refresher. He's like one of the like father of like Civil War poetry. And then the other pieces, I have an excerpt here from Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson, a leading transcendentalist. Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, and then branching off into dark romanticism, we have The Philosophy of Composition by Edgar Allan Poe. And then there's a short story called An Occurrence on Owl Creek Bridge, which is a very famous short story about a Civil War altercation between two different sets of soldiers. So what I'm going to be working with here in the next couple of minutes is I will be showing the transcendentalism slides and kind of walking you through like some of the basic concepts of transcendentalism. A couple of optional pieces, and I find them to just be interesting if you want to know more, is there's a documentary here on transcendentalism and then a documentary called In Search of Walt Whitman. These are not required, but they are very interesting if you find any of their work to be kind of like worthy of more study. I mean, scholars have spent, thousands upon thousands of hours researching these still. But we're going over in kind of a wide breadth. So the two assignments for this week, just to note, is that there is a Walt Whitman free verse poem as a writing workshop. And that is using some of the stylistic elements we're about to go over and using them in your own work. And then the forum post for this week is about the American Civil War and the Transcendentalists. And then I have some directions here about like whether or not you would support some of the concepts from Transcendentalism. And then one of my favorite things is on number 4, we're going to do an experiment where you go out in nature and without any sort of modern technology and kind of reflect on how it felt to be disconnected from your surroundings. But more on that. So those are the tasks for this week. So I'm about to transition over to the transcendentalism slides, and then you'll be on your own. So here we go. All right. So I'm going to transition. So these are my transcendentalism slides. And I tried to make sure that the readings that I chose for y'all were short enough to be pretty manageable, but then also like give you a pretty good swath of this time period and kind of like the different pieces that we're seeing. You don't have a reading response this week, and that's because like since we're going to be doing so many like heavy concepts, I want you to have more flexibility and also to be able to do more things with writing. So you'll notice that there's not a reading response this week. There will be one next week. I'm trying to do them kind of every other week. So, all right. So a couple of things to note about the American Civil War, which is the time period that we're looking at. So the American Civil War was from about 1861 about 1865, fought between the North and the South. We know this. The major issues here we've got slavery, states' rights, economic differences. Over 600,000 soldiers died in the conflict. It was bloody, brutal, divisive. But at the end, the slavery was abolished in the United States. But a big question that was kind of remaining after the American Civil War is how did the war's brutality affect soldiers and civilians? And it was pretty devastating. So a lot of the literature of the time you'll see has the fallen soldier and defying basic conventions of literature that came prior. So it was like young lives. You'll see that in an occurrence in Owl Creek Bridge. Very heroic sacrifices. Lots of like anti-war sentiment, like in occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And then you have changes in conventions and meter. So, like Walt Whitman was one. He's known as the father of free verse poetry because he broke all conventions during this time period. And you had a lot of transcendentalists who were voices of the abolitionist movement during this time. So in Occurrence on Owl Creek Bridge, some things to note is that it was set during the Civil War, but published after the Civil War. So you have like a Confederate sympathizer, but there's a nonlinear narrative structure, and the theme at the end is very surprising. But you've got like the psychological experience, time, death, lots of very sensory-driven imagery of like what it felt like to be a soldier. Um, and then you have our transcendentalists. Okay, so here is a quote from Thoreau that gives you a pretty good understanding of the transcendentalists. So, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn from what they had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life, living so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite unnecessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. So that's the kind of the key concept of the American Transcendentalists. Very much like the founders of the modern hippie movement, connection to nature, society needs to be spurned, like it's all about the individual experience. So the transcendentalist is a very simple idea, which was that people, men and women equally, have knowledge about themselves and the world around them that transcends or goes beyond what they see, hear, taste, touch, feel. So knowledge comes through intuition and imagination as opposed to logic and the senses. So a transcendentalist is a person who accepts those ideas not as religious beliefs, but as an understanding of like life and relationships and making sure that you're connected. So the transcendentalists led the American experience of like self-reliance, individualism, this idea of like the individual person is more important than the social collective. But they were more progressive about women's rights, abolition, reform, education, and they criticized government, organized religion, laws, social institutions, and industrialization that was going on during this time period. So it was very much about like free love, connection to nature, um, a, a, getting away from modern progress. So they created an American state of mind in which imagination was better than reason, which is something that we do still hold on to this day. Um, and so they also believe that humans can transcend limits to reach astonishing heights. Some major authors during this time, the ones we'll read: Emerson, Thoreau. We will not read Margaret Fuller, but she's really interesting. We'll read a little bit of Walt Whitman because he was the foremost poet at the time. And then there's, of course, Louisa May Alcott as well. And so these are all like really prominent authors during this time period. So when you are reading civil disobedience and self-reliance, I want you to keep these thoughts in your mind, like if we were in a class discussion. What was the most shocking statement? So an aphorism is a very short, pithy statement that usually has like a really important truth about life. Like a foolish inconsistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. That is an aphorism. So like, what do you see in there? How much is one's identity is compromised to live in society? Thinking about what claims Thoreau makes about government and purpose, and then responsibilities as a citizen, and then what issues does Thoreau take with reformers and those who are anti-slavery, and then some things to think about beyond that, which is like, what is our obligation to society? What is our obligation to ourselves? Like, how do we fit in the grand scheme of society, which is one of the forum posts for the week. So here are the 10 tenets of transcendentalism. I'm going to go over these pretty quickly, mostly just for time's sake, but live life to the fullest. It is not the length of life, but the depth. And you can read more in detail of these on the slides if you'd like. Thou shalt not conform to society. So making sure that you are disobedient to the government if the government is not fulfilling the needs of the people. Individual. The individual is above society. Do not worship the material, so don't worship things that are goods and things. You need to connect to spirit, disconnect from the earthly world. Be your own mentor, so a person has to understand themselves by being one with nature and spirituality. And then society corrupts an individual's inherent goodness. That was really interesting to think about. Be one with God, not the church. So spirituality was more important than religion. Simplicity, so living life with the honest beauty, being simple, simplifying, taking things down to the brass tacks, and things that are important are natural. Moral values, connectivity to nature is how people interact with the world at large. Nature is sacred. So those are some of the things that are really important to transcendentalists. I have this really interesting, fun letter here that is a letter to Walt Whitman from Ralph Waldo Emerson about leaves of grass and how important it was and how beautiful and demonstrative of the transcendentalist values. And so that's a really interesting way to kind of gauge like the interaction of these authors during this time. I won't read it to you, but it's available on the slides if you'd like to see it. And then last couple things for today is Walt Whitman himself, the poet, the poet of the time, had expansive personality. Stylistically, he used long, sweeping sounds that echoed the Bible in speeches. So as you're reading some of his poetry or revisiting some of his poetry, just kind of remember that he also uses a lot of free verse, which is poetry without rhyme or meter, catalog poems, lots of listing, and then parallel structures. But he doesn't have any sort of like meter or rhyme scheme that's like set, which is what defined him as like a new American poet. Some other things you'll see in his work: alliteration, the pa 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 sound, or like initial consonant sounds. You'll see assonance. You'll see imagery. You'll see onomatopoeia, which are like, the barbaric yop, right? So like singing about something that sounds like something else. And I have
from Song of Myself
piece
by Walt Whitman.
Whoop, that is a piece about
I celebrate myself and sing.
And that is actually my singing or like actually reciting Song of Myself. And so if you'd like to hear that, that is what I would show you if you were in my classroom. And the last couple things is things to note about Romantic era versus Transcendentalist era versus you'll see Poe, which is dark Romanticism. So like while Transcendentalism was about individual and society, when we get into Poe, who's the last one of this era that we're looking at, it's internal evil, psychological terror, anxiety, mystery, nature's threatening and symbolism. And so while you go from like Walt Whitman, who's like, oh, nature is beautiful, connect with the self, Ralph Waldo Emerson, to Poe. And Poe is very dark and sinister. So the last piece that you're going to read is The Philosophy of Composition, which is an interesting rhetorical piece because it is Poe talking about how to write. And so as you're thinking about Poe, or as you're like thinking about him as a part of this era of American tradition, he lived like a cursed life. He talked about revenge all the time. A lot of his work is about losing loved ones, mystery, the elements of unreliable narrators, and reverse psychology, and irony and symbolism, which were very much like emotionally connected, similar to the Transcendentalists, but about more fear and anxiety. And so there's a lot of like exploitation of emotion during this time period. And you'll know, of course, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. So, as you are going to read the philosophy of composition, here are a couple things I want you to think about. Um, so, what did Poe say about the Romantics before him and the value of their writing? Which of his own pieces does Poe use to explain the philosophy of composition? And how do you feel about what he's saying about writing? Do you agree or disagree? What's the tone? Where does it shift? And so these are not things that you necessarily have to like do in an assignment, but they are things that you should be thinking about. And then I do have a little biography here about Poe if you're interested in seeing a little bit more of his work. And again, there is a really interesting, pardon me, but there is a really interesting, just lost my train of thought. There's something interesting somewhere, but we'll find out soon. Okay, so I think I've yapped at you enough. As you're exploring American Romanticism and Transcendentalism and Poe and Emerson and all these like really heavy hitting emotional writers, I can't wait to see how you work with it in regards to your own writing. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Look forward to seeing more later. Toodles.